Honourable Vice President, distinguished delegates, today I am reminding this Council of the indignity and torture of taking hostages. Some, including a few states and non-governmental organisations, even fellow experts, have appealed to me not to mention specific countries or situations, have criticised the timing of my report, or have attempted to obstruct me from speaking out about hostages. Some have even accused me of bias for raising the plight of individuals taken against their will who became bargaining chips in political or financial transactions that they have little or nothing to do with. Yet right now, people of many nationalities, most of them civilians, are being held against their will without access to international observers or consular officials. This report should be welcomed by anyone who believes in human rights for all, who supports an international legal system that does not discriminate between victims, and who seeks to end torture. Hostage-taking is perpetrated by states. It is also perpetrated by non-state actors. I have heard horrifying stories from victims about how they were seized without warning before being held in prisons and other hellholes in jungles, basements, and tunnels. How they were kept captive without proper judicial charges or procedures. What is particularly deplorable is the ways in which hostages are deliberately mistreated as part of perpetrator strategies to secure better concessions. That type of manipulation is unconscionable. As this Council's appointed independent expert on the prohibition on torture, I remind you of your international obligations. That torture is always prohibited. If you are unable to stand up for all hostages, you have no right to speak about human rights in this Council. You must do more to root out this evil. Distinguished delegates, history is littered with examples of hostage-taking. Recently, it has changed dramatically into a cynical, pseudo-diplomatic tool used by a small number of states who detain foreign nationals on fabricated or highly inflated charges to extract confessions from their states. These are not prosecutions on legitimate criminal charges. This is the targeting of foreign or dual nationals to blackmail their country of nationality. My report documents cases in China, Iran, Myanmar, North Korea, Russia, the United Arab Emirates, and Venezuela. There are no official statistics for hostage-taking incidents. Hostage International informs that they have helped more than 500 people affected by hostage-taking and arbitrary detention over the past 2 decades. At the end of 2023, Hostage Aid Worldwide reported that there were people of 53 different nationalities being held hostage or arbitrarily detained globally. In the research for this report, it was clear that the scale is much larger and the geographical spread much wider than these statistics indicate. Hostage-taking is also a weapon of armed groups and criminals. You may immediately think of the 251 men, women, and children who were violently abducted on the 7th of October 2023 by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. Speaking up for these hostages from Israel and more than 20 other countries does not undermine or silence other victims of the ensuing war in Gaza. It is beyond doubt that this conflict has been utterly devastating for Palestinian civilians, and my mandate is pursuing multiple allegations of torture and ill treatment of Palestinians in Israeli detention. At the same time, we must pursue justice for all victims who have been killed, injured, displaced, tortured, and traumatized. The fate of many other hostages remains unknown. According to 2024 data, 82 of the girls abducted from schools in northern Nigeria by Boko Haram are still missing, and at least 30 humanitarian aid workers are being held by the Houthis in Yemen. Mr. Chair, my position is unequivocal. Hostage-taking is almost always a form of torture. The physical and psychological torment inflicted on hostages is severe and lasting. I interviewed more than 20 hostages, former hostages or family members for this report. Many spoke of rancid prison conditions and desperate isolation. Several spoke of beatings, starvation, humiliation, mock executions, and sexual torture. Many were held in prolonged solitary confinement. In itself, a form of torture after 15 consecutive days. They were cut off and left in darkness, starved of social contact and deprived of medical care. They suffered the constant fear of death and the unimaginable anguish of never being found or recovered. Several are still deeply traumatized by these experiences. Families are also victims, living in limbo, waiting for proof of life and release, trying to avoid financial ruin, having to make impossible decisions, with some even forced into silence by their governments. Children of hostages cannot comprehend what has happened. They experience sleeplessness, detachment, anxiety, and withdrawal. The hostages' ordeal is far from over if they are lucky enough to be released. Many suffer PTSD, chronic anxiety, and serious health issues that often require decades of rehabilitation. Some long-term detainees find that their jobs have gone, that their skills are outdated, they are in debt, and that their previous lives have simply disappeared. Mr. President, the report contains a comprehensive set of recommendations. 176 UN member states are party to the 1979 International Convention against the Taking of Hostages. That's nearly as many as you who are party to the Convention Against Torture. Yet the Hostages Convention is rarely mentioned. Despite clear international prohibitions, hostage-taking remains a low-risk, high-reward crime. To change this, perpetrators must be held accountable and punished harshly. I am requesting the International Criminal Court to step up investigations into hostage-taking. For those of you working on the draft international treaty on crimes against humanity, you must ensure that it is amended to include explicit reference to hostage-taking. Meanwhile, states should act to indict and prosecute hostage-takers for torture, as well as those who aid and abet them, including under universal jurisdiction. Families need better representation. It is shocking that there is no entity or person responsible within the UN to advocate for hostages or to represent their interests in negotiations. I ask the Secretary-General, with the support of UN member states, to appoint an SRSG on hostage-taking. I'm also asking governments to appoint senior hostage liaison officers to keep families informed and involved. Targeted sanctions, such as Magnitsky sanctions, should be deployed more rigorously against perpetrators. Confiscated assets and funds could be used to establish a UN hostage support fund. There must be more early warning mechanisms, prevention and monitoring, and more multilateral action. I encourage you to join and support Canada's initiative on arbitrary detention in state-to-state relations. Victims must see justice and be compensated and rehabilitated with long-term psychological, medical and financial support. They should be legally recognised as victims of torture. Distinguished delegates, hostage-taking is a cruel game in which innocents are the pawns. We cannot allow it to become an accepted tool of diplomacy or warfare. Disagreements, grievances, and wars must be settled in accordance with the UN Charter and human rights and through dialogue. People's lives should never be used for political ends. Finally, Mr. Chair, all hostages, whomever they are, wherever they are, and by whomever they are being held, must be released unconditionally and immediately. Every state must play their part to make that happen. Mr. Chair, turning now to country visits. Je voudrais tout d'abord informer le Conseil de la visite que j'ai effectuée au Sénégal en février de cette année, au cours de laquelle j'ai eu le plaisir d'entendre parler des projets du gouvernement visant à améliorer les installations et les conditions pénitentiaires et plus particulièrement à remédier à la très grave surpopulation carcérale. En bref, je les ai encouragés à prendre des mesures encore plus audacieuses. I am looking forward to undertaking my next country visits to Montenegro and Morocco, respectively. I now turn to the report of my country visit to Chile from 16 to 27 October 2023. I express my sincere gratitude to the government for the invitation and the exemplary cooperation. I am also grateful to many other stakeholders whom I met during the visit. For today's purposes, let me reinforce three key areas of recommendations of my report. First, I acknowledge that since the end of the military dictatorship over 30 years ago, Chile has made steady progress in the fields of transitional justice, institution building, and human rights. Their commitment to a democratic and torture-free future is indeed impressive. Efforts have been made to hold accountable those responsible for human rights violations during the Pinochet era. However, many victims remain missing, numerous cases are still pending, and a number of alleged perpetrators are yet to be brought to justice. I call on the government to expedite the adjudication of the remaining historic cases. Second, as Chile has embarked on this positive path, there have been setbacks. In particular, the social unrest Estallido Social in 2019 and the state's heavy-handed response to public demonstrations caused massive human rights violations. I heard many accounts from individuals who were injured, including permanent blindness, in particular because of the use of multiple projectile ammunitions deployed by law enforcement officers. I welcome that the Chilean police force is no longer using the 12 projectile rubber shot weapons used during the 2019 unrest. Crowd control weapons now in stock contain 3 projectiles. However, I emphasize that ammunition and launchers containing multiple projectiles should be decommissioned as they are inaccurate and pose a significant risk to bystanders. Only single-shot, non-lethal weapons are acceptable. I invite the government to consider joining the Alliance for Torture-Free Trade. The third and final issue to mention today is that I also assess the conditions and standards of treatment of persons deprived of liberty in a range of locations. Overcrowding and lack of rehabilitation opportunities were among the main challenges. In the facilities visited, whose infrastructure remains mostly outdated and in need of renovation or replacement, in some facilities, the space per person ratio was far below international standards and amounted to inhuman treatment. Mr. Chair, I look forward to continuing the constructive dialogue with the Government of Chile to support the implementation of my full set of recommendations. Thank you.